Hi, everyone. Welcome to part two of our class today. And so, in part one, what I wanted to focus on is that kind of introduction to sociology. Again, this kind of assuming that a lot of you haven't taken a sociology class before. So, I wanted to provide you a little bit of background into the discipline in terms of what it is, what we do, and how we do it. So, in addition to that, what we did is we went over kind of the course organization, what we're going to be doing in terms of our focus of a class framework, and also what we'll be looking at through that course framework, those five subtopics of the class. So, after today's class, we'll begin part two of our class, and then that's we'll start to look at culture and those different subtopics. But today, again, is more of the introduction day. So, what I did is select the article that you read, the C. Wright Mills piece, because it really gives you an understanding of how we think as sociologists, how people think in sociology. So this kind of captures, again, what you're going to be reading in every book and every article in one way or another. And so, as I mentioned before, this is an opportunity to do the reading reaction on this article. And also, what we'll do is look at the reading in terms of the in-class assignment, which is also due for this piece here. So looking at the sociological imagination, it's actually a book. And so, you're reading kind of an article that's part of that book. But overall, here's my personal copy of it. The sociological imagination was a very influential book. C. Wright Mills is one of the more famous American sociologists. And in addition to this book, he wrote many more that were highly influential in terms of growing sociology as an academic discipline. So if you go to a lot of Western European, a lot of Latin American universities, you'll find that sociology is a very popular major, a very popular area of study compared to the United States, where the popularity is more about studying psychology and psychology as a major. And when Mills kind of was writing all his books, especially the sociological imagination, it kind of turned a lot of people's attention to sociology and kind of away from psychology. And so it's very influential, kind of growing the discipline in the United States. It's always been a big discipline across Europe, but it took a little bit more time to grow in America. And it makes sense. In America, we're very individualistic in terms of focusing on people. And that ties nicely into the study of psychology, where in other countries, we're more collective in nature, and that lends itself more to the study of sociology. So when looking at your reading for today, and when looking at one of the more kind of famous statements in the book, we can say that people, and I paraphrase here because as you probably note, in the reading and, in the book, he says men, but just to kind of, why he did that, basically, back then when he was writing, the 1950s, whatever, you would use men, but when he said men, it meant all people. So, if you think of a businessman, you mean all business people, but sometimes just the language is a carryover from how we used to speak. So men, he meant all people, so men and women. So people make their own history, but not under conditions of their choice. So I want to spend a little bit of time kind of breaking down this statement because it ties in nicely to how we think, what is that sociological imagination? So basically, we can start by looking at the first part of the statement. People make their own history. And so when we say this, we're saying that we have choices that we make, choices that we don't make. We make decisions to do things or not do things. And we are successful at doing things, or perhaps we're not successful. So anyways, we have what we call, in sociology, we call this agency. And sometimes we can think about it as free will. We have the ability to act with intention. We have the ability to kind of do what we want to do. And that's what the first part of the statement makes. We have the ability to make our choices, and based upon those choices, we create our own history, our own life stories. But then we need to turn our attention to the second part. So the second part of the statement, but not under conditions of their choice. And so here, this is important because it gets into really the sociology in terms of how we think that sociological imagination that we're talking about. He says that we do have free will, we do have agency, but we have a lot of conditions that kind of shape our choices, or perhaps limit our choices. And so, the conditions in which we live kind of shape our decisions. Sometimes have a big hand in kind of what we do and why we do it. And so I like to think about these two things, um, what we call kind of the conditions. We call these things social structures, anything that's kind of bigger than the individual that kind of shapes what we do, whether it be class background, one's race, one's sex. And then we kind of look at that social structure and how that relates to an agency. And so those two things come together. And I like to think about it in terms of analogy. It's like playing cards, where you can't do anything about the hand that you're dealt. The hand that you're dealt is kind of outside of your control. And so those are the social structures. Those are the conditions in which we live that kind of shape who we are. But we can play our cards in our own ways. And so there's the agency part, playing the cards, but you don't get to decide the cards that you're dealt. There's the social structure part. So, I always say in terms of, people going to university, you practiced agency. You had to apply to the school. You had to decide to go there once you're accepted. You had to ultimately enroll. So all these things you did to be a college student, to be part of the higher education, you practice a lot of agency along the way. You finish your high school, you decided to take the exams, you decided to do the applications, and ultimately you decided to enroll. So there's the agency. There is how you make your own history, because you could have gone to different schools. You could have not gone to school at all. So you made those decisions. You're making your own history. But there are some conditions under which you live that kind of maybe forced your hand a little bit. So perhaps um, you wanted to go to other schools, but maybe their admission standards were more limiting. So you wanted to attend school A, but your test scores weren't high enough. So there's kind of a larger social force, a policy that kind of shaped you not going there and going somewhere else. Perhaps you wanted to go to school B, and you got into that school, but it just cost too much in terms of one's tuition. So there's another social factor, social class that kind of tied into you maybe coming to Millersville, because relatively speaking, it's less expensive compared to other schools. Or perhaps, maybe you don't really want to get a higher education. You just don't want to, learn more, but you figure that you have to have that college degree to really succeed in today's economy. And so, maybe 30, 40 years ago, you could just have the high school degree and go get a good job, at a local factory, at the local mill, and you didn't have to worry about college. But today, those mills and factories are, relatively speaking, again, non-existent. And the work that does exist today often requires the higher education from the applicant. So, if I could just go and get a job after high school, I would, but I can't, so I should go to college. So that's why, we have a lot of, kind of first generation college students at Millersville for a couple of reasons. The class factor is definitely there, but also, today, maybe unlike your parents, you really need that college degree. So, you're going to college. Yes, you made the choice to enroll, but on the other hand, the economy today maybe forces your hand a little bit because you really need that higher education to succeed. So that's what we're looking at, kind of how we are kind of personal creatures that have the agency, the free will, but also we need to recognize that there's social structures that make up life that often kind of have a hand, have a say in terms of how we live our lives as a whole. And so, overall, I say the sociological imagination can be understood as kind of looking at the connection between the social world and the personal world. So how the personal and social come together to create life. And you think about it basically as a way of thinking. You think about the sociological imagination as a cognitive skill that allows you to see, how social structures shape agency, how the social shapes influences the personal, and kind of the back and forth between the two. Ultimately, that dynamic produces social life as a whole. So, getting into kind of the reading reaction paper, as I mentioned in an earlier video, how you approach this paper would be, Mills is trying to explain the sociological imagination. That's kind of the what. What he's explaining the sociological imagination. And so the next part here is kind of how he's explaining it. So he breaks down the sociological imagination in two different ways. So again, overall, it's a way of thinking, a cognitive skill, connecting the social to the personal. And specifically, he explains it by looking at how public life shapes private life. And so, often we look at one's private life and we tend not to think about the larger kind of social influences that do have an impact on the person and kind of what they do, who they are in terms of their private life. And so basically here we're connecting the dots between what's going on in the public world and what's going on in one's private world. And so just a couple of examples of this could be one's employment status. So typically, when we see somebody who has a job or perhaps is jobless, typically we think it's on that person, him or herself. And so, if you're unemployed, that's because you don't want a job or you haven't tried hard enough to get a job. But sometimes, we're missing the larger social forces in play, and that has a say in terms of if you're employed, if you're not. So again, although we see one's employment status, having a job or not, as very private, all about the person, often it ties into what's going on publicly. And definitely, that connects to what's going on right now in terms of COVID-19. You see how we have this pandemic, and as a result of that, public life shifts dramatically, and that shift in the public realm has an impact on private life. So it's not because people were getting lazy or people didn't want to work anymore, and because the economy switched and because the economy took a downfall, a lot of people found their employment status to be unemployed. Not because personally they did anything wrong, but publicly things change, and that can have an influence on the personal individual. So, how do public realities influence one's employment status? We can look at, the economy, and the economy is strong, you're more likely to, get that job, get the job that you want. But if the economy takes a downturn, you'll be more likely to not be able to find work you like, or maybe not even to find any work as a whole. So again, although we see employment status as very personal, often it's connected strongly to what's going on publicly as well. And so divorce is another thing that we see very personal, very private. If a person gets divorced, it's just between kind of them and their partner. But again, divorce, just like one's employment status, can tie into larger social factors. And so how do public realities influence the likelihood of a couple getting divorced? Again, you can look at issues of the economy. When people are working longer hours, typically the longer hours you put in, the less time you spend with your family. And the less time you spend with your family increases the likelihood of you getting a divorce. So again, sometimes it's almost sad to think about, but sometimes when people go through family troubles, sometimes it's not necessarily about the family members themselves, but more about the situations, socially speaking, the situations in which the family members find themselves in, working long hours, being stressed because you're out of work, and all these factors can eventually tie into why people are getting divorced. So again, you do see in stronger economies, when people kind of work, fewer hours, you see that the likelihood of a divorce actually goes down and decreases. So again, kind of larger social factors, the quality of your work, do you like it or not, the hours you put in, and just having a job or not, and how much money you're making, or perhaps how much money you're not making, and all these factors tie into family life, and they can ultimately make family life better, or they can ultimately make family life worse, which can tie into the likelihood of divorce. So again, we see divorce as very private between two individuals, which it is, but also it's very public in nature as well. What's going on publicly, again, shapes what happens privately. So getting back to the how, he looks at how the public connects to the private. And the second way he describes the sociological imagination is by looking at how history ties into biography. So by history, we're talking about the time period in which we live and how that kind of shapes you in your life story. So again, definitely just because it's convenient, we can look at COVID-19. A lot of you are starting off college, your first year of college, online. And so that's your life story. 10 years from now, when you're doing whatever you're doing and talking about college, you'll say, I remember my first year of college, or my first semester of college, we were online and I didn't step foot in the classroom. And that's nothing in terms of what you decided or what you wanted. That's all about the history in which you currently live. So basically, the time period in which we live has a strong say in terms of our life story, who we are, what we did. So again, you made your own life story. You wrote the book in terms of you're coming to school. You made those decisions, but you being online, that decision was made for you in terms of the history in which you currently live. So, the facts of history become the facts of our life. And kind of a couple examples here. If you want to be a college student or not, you can look at different factors of race. So let me kind of add in here. Variables of sex, race, social class. Copy and paste, or so looking at this idea, how is the time in which I'm living influencing if I'm going to be a college student? That becomes part of my biography. That becomes part of my life story. And so the variables of sex matter. So for a long time, college was only for men. And so, a lot of you now in this class, are women. And so, yes, in this history, you're allowed. You can be a college student if you want to. But if you grew up, in an earlier history, even if you wanted to go to college and get that higher education, you couldn't, because women were excluded. Institutionally speaking, by policy, women were excluded from going to college. So, the history in which you live today allows you to go to school if you're a woman, but in a past history, you would have had a different life story. And that's not because you would have chose things differently, but more about kind of the social circumstances in which you find yourself. So another variable we can look at is race. So yes, we allowed men to go to college, but for a long period of time, it was only white men. So, again, now we have a more diverse, racially speaking, makeup in terms of who a college student is. But in the past, you had to be a male and you had to be a white male specifically. So again, today, race isn't necessarily a factor in terms of being allowed or not allowed, but it's only not a factor today because we've changed the ways we do policy. So again, in a different history, if you're a racial minority, it didn't matter. You simply weren't allowed. You weren't admitted to schools. But today, you can have that as part of your life story because we do have different policies. You do have the ability to make that choice if you want to. And then social class, again, is another factor in terms of, For a long time, college was this kind of seen as, wealthy person's game. So even when women were going to school for the first times, it was only kind of wealthy women going to schools. And so, the same thing for men, when the white men were going to school, it wasn't like working class white men were going to college. It was mostly upper class white men, middle class white men. So again, class was another variable, but today things still kind of open up more compared to the past history. But nevertheless, class still does matter. You don't see, people disproportionately speaking from kind of the poor working classes in college, although, it has increased a little bit. But nevertheless, for some people, they still see college as an option, financially speaking, so they go straight to the workforce. So, we get into the idea of a voter and look at the same variables. So again, today, as long as you are there in terms of your citizenship status, being 18 years of age, you can be a voter if you want. That can be part of your life story. Um, but in the past, maybe you didn't have that choice. Maybe that could not be part of who you are, your biography. And so, I like to think about today, it's kind of think of you as a class. And if I ask you, how many of you can vote in the November election if you wanted to? Yeah. Mostly everybody probably would raise your hand. I know I have some high school students taking this class as well, so maybe you're not, but for the most part, all students would be like, yeah, I could vote if I wanted to. But then I'd ask you the same question, but, coming from a different time period. So basically we can say that, you have to be a male to vote, so in a different history, women weren't allowed to vote. And so then a lot of hands would go down. All the women in class would kind of lower your hand and the guys' hands would still be up. So just kind of look at that. Half the voters are wiped out. And it's because we're talking about a different history, different credentials you had to have to become a voter. And so, in class, we have all the hands up still for the men in class. But then I say, well, we have to be a white male. Because for a long time, again, men could vote, but it was only white men. So then, a lot of hands will go down, and the only hands that remain in the air are the white men. But then if you go back to even earlier history, to be a voter, you had to be white, you had to be male, but also you had to be a landowner. So you had to own your own land, and that ties into social class, because only the wealthy had their own land, had their own property. And so, again, a lot of people's hands would go down. You could be white and male, but a lot of college students don't own their own land. So you usually in class, the only person left with their hand up is me, because I happen to be, a male, white, and I do own land. I do own property. So I'm the only person left to vote if we go back to an earlier history. But today, for the most part, we all can vote. So again, looking at the social and the personal, again, looking at how the time period in which we live often kind of shapes who we are and what we do. But typically, we don't think about the connection. Typically, we ignore those social circumstances, the hand that we're dealt. And we more so focus on kind of what we do, how we play our hands. So those ideas and those examples tie nicely into the in-class assignment. So let me try to pull up, here we go. The in-class assignments, number one, kind of ask you to practice this sociological imagination. So to use the way of thinking that allows us to see how the social world influences the personal world. And so basically, what I kind of just went through, I'm asking you to do for the in-class assignment. So basically here, you're going to select one of the two below. So only focus on one. And basically, I present you two what we call social facts. So it is kind of facts of life today. And so social fact one is that people today have increased musical taste diversity. And basically that means that people today compared to 20 40 years ago, they listened to more types of music. You know, their musical preferences are more diverse in nature compared to the past, where people maybe only liked one or two genres of music. You know, I like rock and roll and I like punk. And then, you know, today people say, yeah, you know, I like rock and roll, I like punk, but I also like hip hop. You know, I also like, you know, dance music or, you know, whatever. So people have more uh, kind of taste. They have more diversity in terms of what they like, in terms of what they listen to in music. So, you know, how do you explain this? So, how do you explain compared to 50 years ago, people listen to more types of music compared to, again, the past? So, what's going on in our history today? What's going on in our public life? What's going on in the social world that promotes people listening to more types of music today that wasn't part of the past histories? So that's what I'm asking you to do for the first example, or you could choose to do the second example. You know, use the sociological imagination to explain why people today have more personal debt. So, we could explain it on the individual level. You know, people uh, are careless with their money. People spend too much money, so that's why they're in debt. But as sociologists, we do recognize that some people are like that. But you know, the main reason why we do have more debt today compared to the past can be answered better sociologically rather than blaming people for being, you know, lazy or just not doing well with their money and their savings. We look at things sociologically and say there's certain realities of our history today, about our lives today, that make people go into higher amounts of debt. So yes, it is a choice to take the loan. It is a choice to use your credit card. But what's going on in terms of our lives today that kind of promotes people having more debt today compared to the past? So those are the two things. I'm asking you to explain one of two social facts: why people have more debt today, or why people listen to more types of music today. And then your answer would basically, highlight what's going on in the social world that would make people listen to more types of music, or that would make people go into higher levels of debt. So I just wanted to touch on that briefly. Again, as always, if you have any questions, please let me know, and I'll leave that there for today.